So one indicator of the effectiveness of this long-term development aid is that countries that have been major recipients of aid in the past, countries such as China, India, Brazil and Thailand, have now developed to such an extent where they're actually major aid donors to poorer countries. So the argument is that the aid they received likely played some role in the development of those countries to such an extent, to achieve such success, that they're now able to provide aid to poorer countries themselves. If we think about the emergency relief, the short-term humanitarian aid, well, clearly where a clear short-term need is identified, for example, for food supplies in a famine, short-term emergency relief can clearly be very effective at saving lives. And to give some examples from this country, according to the British government, British aid since 2010 has actually funded 11 million children going through primary school. So in terms of their long-term development aid, that's a clear indicator of success, that there are now 11 million children who've received that basic education they would not have done without aid. And that's just from one country, from Britain. And according to David Cameron, immunisation programmes funded by British international aid are now saving one child's life every 2 minutes. So, again, immediate disaster relief or humanitarian aid, targeted effectively, clearly can help to save lives. Okay, coming on to the arguments against international aid. One argument that you often hear is made by so-called realists. Now, realism is a school of thought within international relations that basically argues states are and should be concerned only with their national self-interest. And they argue that states should therefore concern themselves only with their own citizens' welfare, not with the welfare of citizens elsewhere. And according to this argument, countries that prioritize anything other than their own national self-interest are wrong-headed, and they're likely to be counterproductive. A second argument is that far from countering the structural disadvantages and structural inequalities of the global economy, aid can actually serve to entrench and deepen patterns of global inequality. And the way it can do this is by discouraging countries from becoming more competitive. So this is the argument made by, for example, Dambisa Moyo, who's a development theorist, African development theorist, who argues that actually aid, what it does is it fosters what she calls a culture of dependency. And she argues that what's really needed to bring countries out of poverty and for them to develop and so on is entrepreneurship. But she believes African entrepreneurship is actually being undermined by aid programs. So, for example, if you think you're an African entrepreneur, you've got a business idea, you want to set up a business, for example, making and selling clothes. Well, if there's charities and so on from the West coming and providing free second-hand clothes as a form of charity all over your country, then of course you're not going to be able to find a market for your product very easily. And she argues this is what's happening in many different fields, is that entrepreneurship is being undermined by aid, and aid is effectively being used almost as a form of dumping. Dumping is something economists talk about when wealthy countries that have a surplus of goods, more goods than they need, will actually dump it on other countries at below cost price. Or if we're talking about aid, then they'll provide it for free. And of course, if you're trying to sell a particular product in that country, you've got no chance if someone's coming along and providing the product for free. So from this point of view, aid can distort markets. It can bankrupt local producers. For example, Kenya in the 1980s received a lot of food aid in the form of wheat, free wheat given by US farmers, given by the US, provided by the US to Kenya. Now what this did was put Kenya's domestic farmers out of business. So now they're in a position of dependency where they have to import, they have to rely on imported wheat and so on, which again has contributed rather than tackled the problems of global inequality and dependence and so on. Another example, recent example, a British aid program seen as very successful, in fact, in many ways. In Uganda, there's a program to supply British-made mosquito nets to Uganda. it was very successful in countering malaria, but what it did is put the country's own producers of mosquito nets out of business. And now we're seeing a problem emerging where, as those British nets are becoming worn out and need replacing, people are finding there's no domestic producers left. They can't get hold of them. There's nowhere to buy these things from because the donated mosquito nets put their own domestic producers out of business. A further argument against aid is that it can actually help to prop up corrupt and autocratic, that's undemocratic, governments. So corrupt governments may prevent aid getting where it's needed, siphoning it off for themselves to fund their own affluent lifestyles, but also to buy political support. So you often hear stories actually in famines of governments receiving emergency aid from other countries, but then those governments will restrict the delivery of aid to their supporters, and that will prop up their own power base. And in this sense, aid might actually serve to prop up and entrench autocratic rulers, and therefore undermine the rise of democracy. And many development theorists, such as Amartya Sen, believe that democracy is crucial to development. It's crucial to prosperity. It's a criteria necessary for prosperity. So if democracy is crucial to prosperity, then by helping to prop up undemocratic rulers, aid can therefore actually undermine future prosperity as well. So for example, Ethiopia, Rwanda and Uganda are all major recipients of British aid. The three of the biggest recipients of British aid in Africa. But all of them have been accused of widespread human rights violations and undemocratic means of propping up their rule. For example, just recently 400 people have been killed in protests in Uganda. So if aid, the argument is, well, if aid is propping up undemocratic rulers, that again is actually undermining future prosperity, which relies on democracy. A further argument, and this is an argument against the idea that aid can be used in the mutual benefit of donor and recipient countries, as we looked at earlier. There's an argument aid is actually not usually structured to meet the interests and meet the requirements of the recipient countries, but actually of the donor countries. So, for example, the two biggest recipients of US aid, just pause the video even if you want for a moment and just think to yourself, who do you think might be the two biggest recipients of US aid? Have a little think about it. The answer is actually Israel and Egypt. They're the two biggest and have been for a long time, receive the most aid, mostly in the form of military aid, right? Provision of military equipment and training and so on. And now this is not, this aid is clearly not designed to serve the interests and meet the needs of the populations of those countries. It's designed to keep those countries as US allies, working for US interests, to uphold US interests in the region, and to keep spending their money on US weapons and so on and so forth. And the US in particular often ties its aid programs to trade deals. So it demands that countries who receive aid packages must open up their markets to US investment and imports and so on. Similar to the structural adjustment programs we looked at, where loans were made conditional on accepting certain trade, lifting trade restrictions, so too aid is often made conditional on the same requirements. So again, from this point of view, this is actually helping. Aid is used as a tool, as a weapon even, by the wealthy countries as part of their arsenal of means of persuading poorer countries to adopt policies that benefit them, that benefit the wealthy countries. And arguably there's little evidence actually of aid boosting economic growth or alleviating poverty in any sustainable long-term way. So for example, William Easterly has pointed out that Africa's per capita income has not increased at all in the last 4 decades, despite receiving almost $1 trillion of aid during that period. One final argument against aid is that aid can never, and this is not so much an argument against aid as such, but it's an argument that aid almost acts as a diversion from what really needs to be done. And it's the argument that aid by itself can never resolve global poverty, because it overlooks the more fundamental injustices that are perpetuated, for example, by debt payments, by the use of tax havens, by TNCs setting up in the global south and exploiting the workforce and taking the profits out of the country, by structural adjustment programs, by the persistent use of military force against the global south. And all of these factors mean that the flow of wealth from north to south, as we said, is completely dwarfed compared to the flow in the other direction. And as we said, one NGO, Global Financial Integrity, estimates that for each dollar of aid from north to south, no less than $24 flows in the other direction. Dambisa Moyo again has argued that aid is basically a diversion from more urgent priorities, such as debt relief. And actually aid functions therefore to allow Western countries to avoid the issue and thereby perpetuate the problem. So, for example, Britain, it continues to use military force against, Britain's at war in 7 countries at the moment, through its drone program and so on, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Iraq, and so on. These kinds of issues, the fact that the British-controlled network of tax havens is sucking money out of the South and channeling it into the banks in London and New York, these kinds of issues are ignored because then the British government says, well, we're paying our 0.7% of GDP in aid, so we're on the side of the good, so we're doing the right thing. Aid is used from this perspective to cover up the crimes, if you like, of wealthy